My parents gave my sister a $2,000 gift for her graduation, but she sold it for $500 and humiliated our family on social media. I had long assumed that there were two clear categories in my family. My older sister, Andrea, who seemed to be the Hollywood star of our little house in the suburbs of New Jersey, and me, who was something like a supporting character in a movie where my turn to shine never came. My whole life, my parents repeated to me, with forced smiles, phrases like everyone gets what they deserve, while they gave Andrea expensive and absurdly lavish gifts that she did not even appreciate. And I, on the other hand, had to settle for used books, secondhand clothes, and a smile with a thank you, always on my lips so as not to sound ungrateful. They told me it was a matter of maturity, that my sister tried harder, that she valued good things, lies that I swallowed with anger and frustration, hoping that someday life itself would teach them all a lesson equally. A little over a month ago, the perfect excuse to continue spoiling Andrea came when she finished her brand new master's degree in finance. For my parents, this seemed like the equivalent of finding the cure for cancer or discovering life on another planet. So, obviously, it had to be celebrated in style. They decided to throw a party at home, something they never did with me when I finished my psychology degree because, according to them, that had no economic future. Of course, because apparently everything in this life comes down to money in this materialistic and superficial family. The worst part was that they announced they had a surprise gift for Andrea, something that would make it clear how proud they were of her effort and determination. Nice words were never lacking when it came to her, and that day was no exception. When Andrea opened that box wrapped with a ridiculously exaggerated bow and pulled out a latest generation MacBook Pro, I swore a vein was going to explode in my forehead. That computer cost more than $2,000, and I had never in my life seen such an expense on anything that was not for the house or some urgent medical problem. But there was my sister, jumping excitedly, feigning gratitude in front of everyone, her eyes shining more at the idea of showing off that device on Instagram than at the gift itself. My parents were moved to tears, naively believing that she was truly happy and grateful. I, on the other hand, knew exactly how it would end, because I knew well the kind of superficial and self-centered person my sister was. I did not have to wait long to confirm my suspicions. The next day, while having breakfast and checking my social networks, I almost spit out my coffee when I saw that Andrea had posted several stories on Instagram bragging about how she had resold the MacBook on Marketplace for $1,500. I was frozen watching the video in which, without any shame or respect, she held a wad of cash while laughing and saying, "My parents are idiots. They spent a fortune on garbage, and now I have easy cash." I felt a mixture of anger and satisfaction, because I knew that as soon as that reached my parents' eyes, the storm would be inevitable. And so it was, because that video was quickly shared among our relatives, friends, neighbors, and acquaintances in the neighborhood. Everyone commented, between jokes, laughter, and criticism, how Andrea had publicly humiliated our family, displaying the superficiality and lack of values that my parents had cultivated with such dedication. That same afternoon, when I returned home, I found my parents in the middle of a monumental fight with Andrea in the living room. My mother shouted indignantly that she had never felt so much shame, while my father was red as a tomato and demanded an explanation from my sister, who simply replied with absolute disdain, saying that it was her gift and she could do whatever she wanted with it. I, from the hallway, listened to everything, feeling for the first time in years that divine justice had finally decided to appear in our house, even if only for a moment. My parents were desolate, ashamed that we were now the center of all the neighborhood mockery, pointed out as a ridiculous and naive family. For the first time in my life, I felt that Andrea was paying, even if only partially, for years of absurd and unjustified favoritism. However, that night, as I went to bed, I kept thinking about something else. As much as Andrea had publicly exposed the ridiculousness of my parents and how spoiled she was, I knew this could not be the end of it. I did not just want justice. I wanted her to learn a lesson that would mark her deeply, something that would make her regret for a long time being so superficial and selfish. I then began to meticulously plan a revenge that would not only restore some dignity to our family, but would leave Andrea humiliated in a way that she could never forget. After all, If I had learned anything from so many years of being the forgotten child, it was how to play the game of patience and strategy, so that when I delivered the final blow, she would have no way to defend herself. Update 1. Exactly 2 weeks passed since that chaotic scene in the living room of our house. The atmosphere in my home was so tense that it felt like a bomb about to explode at any moment. And every time my parents crossed paths with Andrea in the hallways, they exchanged cold and uncomfortable glances, as if they were complete strangers. My sister tried to act normally, feigning indifference to everything that had happened, but I knew perfectly well that the scandal had affected her more than she was willing to admit. It was evident in her gestures, in the way she anxiously checked her cell phone every 5 minutes, and in the shadows that were beginning to appear under her eyes from lack of sleep. Her social networks, once so active and full of interactions, were now flooded with negative comments, harsh criticism, and constant mockery about her superficiality and selfishness. For someone like her, who had built her entire identity around the approval of others, this was a slow and constant torture that gave me a satisfaction that was difficult to hide. Meanwhile, my parents had decided to lock themselves in a kind of strange denial. They pretended that nothing had happened, as if by ignoring the situation, it could magically vanish. But, obviously, that did not happen. In conversations with neighbors or relatives, the uncomfortable topic of the famous resold MacBook and how Andrea had publicly exposed the ridiculousness of their decisions as parents always came up. Little by little, they themselves became the target of heavy jokes and sarcastic comments every time they attended meetings or events in the community. I felt some pity for them, but at the same time, I could not help but think they deserved it. After so many years of unjustified favoritism, they were finally experiencing firsthand the consequences of indulging to the absurd a person as selfish and narcissistic as my older sister. In the midst of all this, I began to slowly execute my plan to deepen Andrea's humiliation. I knew I had to be extremely careful and patient so as not to raise suspicions, so I pretended to remain neutral and indifferent to the constant arguments and tensions at home, acting as if all of that was foreign to me. I took advantage of every moment alone to carefully review any opportunity that could serve me to hit her where it hurt most. My sister was careless and overly confident in her own intelligence, believing that no one could ever discover her little secrets, and that is precisely what allowed me to find what I needed. One afternoon, while she was out with some friends, although I doubted anyone really wanted to keep seeing her after all this, I went into her room with the excuse of looking for a charger she had supposedly lent me. Among messy papers and clothes piled on her desk, I almost accidentally found a small leather-bound diary that, from how worn it was, seemed important. I knew that invading her privacy in that way was extreme, but at that point, I did not care at all. If she could publicly expose our entire family without remorse, I also had the right to use any tool at my disposal to return the favor. I spent almost an hour reviewing page after page, discovering things about her that I had never imagined, and that made me detest her even more. The diary was full of superficial confessions about how much she hated having to feign gratitude toward my parents, how she despised the friendships she cultivated only for convenience, and how she constantly manipulated everyone around her to get what she wanted. But the most valuable thing of all was a specific page where Andrea had written down details of her famous sale on Marketplace, including names, dates, and potential buyers who never completed the purchase, thus exposing her stupidity and arrogance. This was pure gold for me, because it gave me the perfect opportunity to initiate an even deeper and more personal humiliation, something she would never see coming, and that would expose her as the liar and manipulator she really was. During the following days, with absolute discretion, I dedicated myself to searching social media for each of those people Andrea had contacted. Initially, I created a fake profile, carefully crafted with stock photos and credible posts, pretending to be a technology lover and collector of Apple products. I did not want to make any mistakes that would jeopardize my identity or leave traces leading back to me. I knew perfectly well that any mistake, however small, would ruin my plan, and I was not willing to fail after so much effort. After several hours of fake messages and conversations, I finally managed to contact one of Andrea's frustrated buyers, a young man who lived not far from our city and was especially interested in finding exactly the model that my sister had so shamelessly resold. I wrote to him, introducing myself as a serious collector interested in making an irresistible offer for that same MacBook Pro, assuring him that the equipment came complete with warranty, original invoice, and in perfect condition, and that, moreover, I was willing to pay much more than usual to get it quickly. It was not difficult to convince him. In just a few hours, we had arranged a meeting at a downtown coffee shop, a crowded place perfect for the plan I had prepared. Everything was going much better than I had imagined, and I could not help but feel a kind of adrenaline rush through my veins thinking about Andrea's face when she realized what was about to happen to her. That same night, I made sure to erase any trace of my internet activity, meticulously hiding every detail that could link me to what was about to happen. I knew I was playing with fire, but honestly, I did not care anymore. I was willing to go to any lengths to teach my sister a lesson, convinced that the only way she would learn was by suffering a humiliation as public and devastating as the one she had put us through. Update 2. A week after arranging that fake appointment, everything was ready to carry out my plan. During those days, while Andrea was still dealing with the online ridicule and the obvious family discomfort, I had carefully prepared every detail of the trap she was about to fall into. I knew I needed to stay cold and calculating, acting normally in front of my parents and sister without revealing the slightest emotion or change in my attitude. At home, I pretended to be the same patient and calm brother as always, the eternal supporting character who seemed to be completely oblivious to the prevailing tension. This was necessary, as any suspicious gesture could jeopardize everything I had been planning with so much effort and dedication. I could not allow my sister to suspect anything, especially when I was so close to fulfilling my purpose. Finally, the day arrived for the meeting at the downtown coffee shop, strategically located near the city's busy shopping district. During the morning, I feigned total indifference while having breakfast at home, sharing the table with Andrea, who constantly looked at her phone anxiously, probably looking for a way out of the mess she had created herself. I found it ironic to see her like that, so vulnerable and nervous, when she had always acted with arrogance and superiority towards me. Before leaving, I said goodbye to my parents naturally, mentioning that I would be out for a while to run some errands and meet up with some friends. They did not even bother to ask where I was going, too caught up in their own worries and internal conflicts to pay me any attention. That invisibility, which at another time would have deeply hurt me, had now become my best ally. I arrived early at the agreed place, discreetly dressed in casual clothes so as not to attract attention, and strategically positioned myself in a secluded corner of the establishment from where I could perfectly observe everything that would happen without being seen. I knew my sister would not be long in arriving, anxious to get that easy money she craved so much. Just as I had foreseen, Andrea appeared exactly 5 minutes before the agreed time, carrying a branded bag, inside which was surely the box of the famous MacBook Pro that she had rebought secondhand after the initial scandal. I watched her enter hurriedly, looking in all directions to find her supposed buyer, without suspecting for a second that she was being watched from several angles. The guy I had arranged the fake appointment with was already waiting for her, sitting at a table near the window. He was wearing elegant clothes, appearing to have a lot of money, something that evidently excited my sister. Andrea smiled broadly at him, sitting across from him and carefully placing the bag on the table as they began to exchange words. From my discreet position, I could see how she tried to appear confident, talking exaggeratedly and moving her hands to emphasize every detail, probably explaining why she was selling the laptop at such a high price. I knew that at that very moment she believed she was making the deal of her life, convinced that she would leave that place with more easy money in her hands. However, just a few minutes later, exactly what I had planned happened. From my cell phone, I made an anonymous call to the local police, reporting a possible sale of stolen goods at that same coffee shop. I gave them specific details that made them take the report seriously and quickly go to the location. Andrea was still very focused on her conversation with the supposed buyer when 2 officers discreetly entered the establishment, observing the situation before approaching the table directly. My sister's face instantly paled when she noticed the presence of the police in front of her, and she immediately began to look frantically around, surely trying to understand what the hell was going on. It was at that moment that the officers asked her to open the bag and show the invoice and warranty for the equipment she was selling. My sister, clumsy and nervous, took out the MacBook Pro box and began to stammer nonsensical excuses, saying that the original invoice had been stolen and that she only had the equipment, but that she could assure them it was not stolen. The officers did not seem convinced, especially when she could not clearly demonstrate how she had once again obtained that laptop that she had resold days before and was now trying to resell a second time. Realizing how suspicious and confusing her whole explanation sounded, the police kindly asked her to accompany them outside the coffee shop to clarify everything in private. At that precise moment, several people inside and outside the premises began to record the scene with their cell phones, intrigued by the drama unfolding before their eyes. Andrea left, accompanied by the officers, who were holding the bag with the laptop in question while they asked her more specific questions. Her face reflected a mixture of despair, shame, and deep bewilderment as she realized that she was once again being humiliated in public, but this time in a much more serious and compromising way. I discreetly got up and left through another door to watch the rest from a safe distance, enjoying the show as people murmured around and continued recording every detail. The news spread quickly on social media, with photos and videos that soon went viral under titles like "Attempted Fraud at Local Coffee Shop," "Young Reseller Arrested on Suspicion of Theft," and other even more ridiculous headlines. Hours later, at home, I received the news through a family group message, in which my parents, embarrassed and indignant, commented on the new public humiliation Andrea had caused them. I feigned surprise and indignation, joining in their comments and deeply regretting that my older sister had not learned from her mistakes. Internally, however, I felt an indescribable satisfaction knowing that I had hit exactly where it hurt most: her precious public reputation and her superficial image built on lies and manipulation. For the first time in years, I felt that real justice was being done in my family, and that Andrea was experiencing the true consequences of her actions, consequences that she herself had unleashed with her selfishness and excessive arrogance. Update 3. Exactly 3 days had passed since the coffee shop incident, and our house had been transformed into a kind of emotional minefield, where every conversation was a potential explosion of reproaches and bitter arguments. My parents, still in shock from the public humiliation that Andrea had caused this time, could barely look her in the eyes without showing deep disgust and disappointment, which became more evident with each uncomfortable silence that flooded our table. During meals, my sister, for her part, seemed to finally understand the gravity of the situation. Her face looked tired, dark-circled, and her usual arrogance had given way to a permanent expression of dejection and despair. It was clear that reality had hit hard, and that her superficial world was crumbling little by little right before her eyes. The viral spread of the images and videos of Andrea being questioned by the police in front of the coffee shop was unstoppable. During those days, the comments on social media had not only grown in number, but had also increased in cruelty and sarcasm. People we did not even know were having fun making fun of my sister, labeling her a thief, pathetic, scammer princess, or even worse things. And there was no shortage of those who shared memes mocking our entire family. Some neighbors, friends of my parents, and even former classmates came indirectly to comment, with false concern, that they should control their daughter better, suggesting, between veiled laughter, that all this had been the fault of excessive pampering. My parents received these comments with their heads down, bearing the weight of a shame so heavy that it seemed to be slowly wearing them down. My mother cried on more than one occasion over the situation, while my father, usually a firm and proud person, now avoided going out unless it was absolutely necessary. I watched all this in silence, always maintaining the mask of neutrality that I had perfected over time. Although inside I enjoyed the karma that finally caught up with Andrea, I quickly realized that I had taken all of this much further than I had originally planned. Still, I did not feel remorse, but rather a strange satisfaction mixed with a touch of unease. I now understood that there was no turning back, and that my sister was paying dearly for her superficiality and selfishness, although perhaps more harshly than even I had imagined at first. But in a way, it was fair. What she needed to understand that she could not continue treating everyone as if they were disposable objects, especially our family, who had always done everything to please her, even at the cost of constantly relegating me to the background. The situation took an even more dramatic turn when, that same afternoon, we received an unexpected visit from an officer from the local police department. The officer's presence at our door immediately triggered an even deeper crisis in the house. My parents, totally dismayed and panicked, received him in the living room, trying to appear calm, while Andrea remained in her room, locked up and avoiding directly facing the consequences of her actions. The officer, in a firm and professional voice, explained that due to the initial complaint, the situation had become legally complicated, and Andrea was obligated to officially clarify the whole situation at the local police station. My parents, desperate to avoid any legal charges against their daughter, promised to fully cooperate, assuring that everything had been a misunderstanding and that Andrea was deeply sorry for what had happened. While I watched the scene discreetly from the staircase, I could not help but wonder if she really felt any genuine remorse, or was simply desperate to clear her name to quickly return to her superficial life. Finally, Andrea had no choice but to leave her room and face the policeman directly. Her appearance was pitiful. She was wearing old, worn clothes. Her hair was pulled back messily, and her eyes were noticeably swollen from crying. It was shocking to see her in such a state, so different from the neat and perfect image she had always projected in public. When she sat down in front of the officer, she began to speak in a broken voice, trying uselessly to maintain a semblance of calm while explaining her version of events. Her story was clumsy, full of contradictions and absurd excuses that clearly reflected that she still did not understand the gravity of her actions. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuine pity for her, although I quickly remembered all the times her selfishness had harmed our family, and that feeling disappeared almost immediately. When the officer finally left, informing us that Andrea would have to go to the station personally to formalize a written statement the next day, my mother burst into tears again, saying between sobs that our family would never recover from such public humiliation. My father, in an exhausted and defeated voice, simply murmured that he hoped Andrea would at least learn something from all of this, although it was already too late to avoid the shame that would continue to accompany us for a long time. Andrea, meanwhile, locked herself back in her room without saying a word, surely understanding that the social punishment and the absolute loss of her image and prestige were already inevitable. For my part, that night, in the solitude of my room, I reflected deeply on everything that had happened. I knew that I had caused that situation, but at the same time, I felt that I had acted justly. Andrea had always been the spoiled queen of the house, the pampered child who never received real consequences for her bad actions. Now, she was finally experiencing firsthand the weight of responsibility and shame, facing the reality that she had avoided for so long with lies, superficiality, and selfishness. At that moment, I decided that I would continue acting as if I had absolutely nothing to do with all of this, letting fate take its natural course and watching from a distance as my sister, little by little, faced the monster she herself had created. In the end, perhaps only then would she learn the lesson she needed, even if it meant completely destroying the false image of perfection that she had so carefully constructed for so many years. Update 4. A week had passed since the police officer's visit, and the situation in our house seemed to have reached a point of no return. The tension was so palpable that every time I walked through the door, I felt as if I were entering hostile territory. My parents, deeply worn down by the shame and constant scandal, barely spoke to each other, and when they did, it was only to exchange curt, reproachful phrases about how they had raised Andrea. There were entire days when Mom avoided leaving her room, taking refuge in television or crying discreetly, while my father locked himself in the garage fixing things that did not need fixing, with the clear intention of escaping the reality that was slowly consuming them. For the first time in my life, our house, which had always been a bustling and active place, was submerged in an uncomfortable and sad silence, broken only by the occasional sounds of whispers or muffled arguments. Andrea, for her part, seemed to be living a true personal hell. Her situation had become considerably more complicated since she had had to formally appear at the police station. Although in the end she did not face serious criminal charges thanks to the intervention of my parents and some convincing explanations provided by the hired lawyers, ultimately, the public humiliation was already irreversible. On social media, her image continued to be attacked daily, to the point that she ended up closing all her accounts after receiving countless insults and ruthless mockery. What seemed to hurt her most was the abrupt disappearance of all those superficial friendships that used to cluster around her like flies attracted to fame and popularity. Now, no one wanted to associate with the scammer girl, and Andrea became a kind of social pariah who locked herself in her room for days on end, avoiding any human contact, including her own parents and, of course, me. But the real surprise came exactly 1 week after that police visit. On a cold Saturday night, I was lying in bed, calmly checking my social media, when I heard my cell phone vibrate insistently. Looking at the screen, I saw Andrea's name lighting up in the darkness, and for a moment I hesitated whether to answer her or not. Finally, driven by curiosity more than anything else, I accepted the call. On the other end of the line, I heard a broken, barely recognizable voice whispering my name with a mixture of sadness and despair that I had never heard in her before. Andrea began to speak bluntly, telling me directly that she needed to talk to me urgently, that she felt lost, and that, although I did not deserve it, I was the only person she could count on at that moment. She asked me, practically begging me, to come see her in her room, as she did not even feel capable of going out and facing my parents' gaze. I walked slowly down the dark hallway, wondering what the hell she was up to now, aware that any attempt at manipulation was not going to work with me this time. However, when I opened the door and saw my sister sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking and her eyes downcast, I immediately understood that there was no pretense or strategy behind that call. Andrea, the most confident and arrogant person I knew, seemed absolutely emotionally shattered, wrapped in a deep sadness that contrasted brutally with her usual haughty attitude. Before I could say anything, she began to speak quickly, as if afraid that I would decide to leave at any moment, admitting through tears that she finally understood the damage she had caused to all of us. She confessed that she not only regretted having sold that stupid MacBook, but also how she had treated our parents and me for years, acknowledging that she had always acted like a complete egotist, ignoring the feelings of those around her just to satisfy her insatiable need of attention and external validation. In the midst of her desperate monologue, Andrea looked me straight in the eyes and asked me for help, real and honest help, to try to repair at least some of the damage caused. For the first time in our lives, she clearly told me that she knew I was a better person than her, that she understood how unfair our parents had been to me during all those years, and that, although she did not deserve my compassion, she hoped I could forgive her someday. It was an incredibly uncomfortable and heartbreaking moment, because I had never imagined Andrea uttering those words, much less acknowledging that she had been unfair to me. I felt a strange mixture of bitter victory and genuine compassion, seeing her so vulnerable and humiliated by life itself, finally acknowledging the consequences of her actions. But although I appreciated her apparent sincerity, I could not let it all end so easily. I remembered all the times she belittled me in front of friends and family, every time my parents had ignored me in favor of her absurd whims, and all those injustices accumulated in my chest began to slowly come out in the form of harsh but necessary words. I replied that I perfectly understood her regret, but that did not erase the damage caused over the years. I clearly demanded that if she really wanted my help and support, she would have to do something extremely difficult for her. Publicly face everything she had done, acknowledging her mistakes and her lack of respect towards our family to everyone. Only then, I firmly assured her, could I consider offering her the help she was asking for. Andrea listened to every word without protest, nodding slowly, her eyes filled with tears, aware that there was no other possible way. We then agreed that she would do a live broadcast through the only social network she had left open, and that in front of all those who had condemned and humiliated her, she would publicly apologize, admitting her arrogance and acknowledging how her superficiality had deeply hurt those who loved her most. She promised me, with complete seriousness, that she would do it that same night, without further excuses or postponements. Leaving her room, I felt, for the first time, a strange peace inside, knowing that a very painful chapter in our family history was about to close. However, I also clearly understood that, even if this was a victory for me, there were still very deep wounds to heal, especially between my parents and Andrea. Still, something inside me was satisfied to have reached this point, convinced that I had finally managed to impose justice in the face of years of unjustified favoritism. Now all that remained was to wait and see how Andrea faced what would undoubtedly be the most humiliating and revealing moment of her entire life. Final update. 3 days had passed since that decisive conversation with Andrea, and the night of the live broadcast had become one of those moments I could hardly forget. I clearly remember sitting silently in my room, phone in hand, holding my breath, watching the clock slowly tick towards the appointed time. My parents, oblivious to what was about to happen, were still locked in their own world of reproaches and resentment, completely unaware of the public confession my sister had decided to make. For the first time in her life, that night the atmosphere at home was especially cold and silent, as if the house itself sensed that something important was about to change forever in our family. When Andrea finally started the live broadcast, the whole world seemed to stop. Her face appeared on the screen, visibly affected by days without sleep, with an expression of deep sadness and such raw honesty that it was difficult to recognize the same arrogant and haughty person who had grown up beside me for so many years. Thousands of people immediately began to connect, many driven by the morbid curiosity of witnessing the final fall of the superficial scammer, others genuinely surprised by the courage Andrea showed in publicly facing her mistakes. I remained completely attentive to every word, aware that this was the culminating moment of all the chaos I had unleashed with my silent revenge, but also knowing that it was absolutely necessary to heal, even partially, the wounds caused by so many years of family injustices. In a trembling but determined voice, Andrea began to speak in front of the camera. Her monologue was deep and sincere, and I heard her publicly confess how, throughout her life, she had been carried away by superficiality and ambition, deliberately ignoring the emotional damage she caused to those who loved her most. She admitted that she had constantly manipulated our parents to obtain benefits, acknowledging that she had always been aware of the unequal treatment they gave me, and that she had never done anything to correct it. With tears visible in her eyes, my sister acknowledged, in front of thousands of people, that selling that MacBook had been an act of contempt towards our family, an act that, at the time, seemed fun and opportune, but that now filled her with shame and regret. She explicitly mentioned how she had cruelly mocked my parents' generosity, describing her behavior as shameful and cowardly, finally acknowledging that the real culprits were themselves for having spoiled her to unbearable limits. As Andrea spoke, the broadcast filled with rapid messages and immediate reactions from the audience. At first, many people reacted with mockery and sarcasm, but as her speech progressed, the general tone began to slowly change to a mixture of surprise, admiration, and respect for her unexpected sincerity. The live chat went from being a constant stream of insults and mockery to a series of messages supporting her, thanking her for her courage, and acknowledging the difficulty of publicly admitting her mistakes in that way. For the first time in many years, my sister received genuine and authentic support, completely different from the empty flattery she was used to. At that moment, I clearly understood that Andrea was experiencing a profound change, one that would mark her forever, finally teaching her the true value of respect and honesty. The most surprising thing happened towards the end of her broadcast. Andrea, looking directly at me through the screen with tears streaming down her cheeks, mentioned my name explicitly in front of everyone. In a broken but firm voice, she confessed that I was probably the only decent person in our entire family, publicly acknowledging that for years I had silently endured unfair and unequal treatment without ever receiving a single show of support. She apologized to me directly in front of everyone, admitting that I was the one who truly deserved everything she had unfairly received for years, and that she deeply regretted not having seen it before. That absolutely unexpected moment for me caused an explosion of comments and reactions that flooded the screen in seconds, all of them highlighting my name and acknowledging how difficult it must have been to live in Andrea's constant shadow. My parents, who finally heard the noise and commotion coming from my room, entered confused, finding that live broadcast and hearing the harsh words of their favorite daughter live. Their faces paled instantly, and as they stared at the screen in absolute silence, I could clearly see how they finally realized the true magnitude of the damage caused by years of absurd favoritism. My mother began to cry inconsolably, hugging my father while he remained still and in shock, unable to take his eyes off the repentant face of his eldest daughter, who continued to crudely expose her own superficiality and selfishness. That night, our family finally faced the truth, however harsh it was, clearly understanding that every selfish action and every bad decision had led to exactly that point of inevitable crisis. The next day, our house became a scene of difficult conversations, sincere apologies, and shared tears. Andrea came out of her room, bravely facing my parents' reaction and confronting me directly for the first time since that broadcast. My parents, deeply ashamed, finally admitted in front of us that they had made huge mistakes in the way they had raised us, explicitly acknowledging the emotional damage they had unintentionally caused me. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, valued, and recognized by those who had always looked the other way. And although I knew this did not magically erase years of frustration and pain, it was a genuine first step towards a possible family reconciliation. As time went on, our lives slowly began to rebuild, although it never went back to the way it was before. Andrea, after that deep public humiliation and sincere repentance, decided to distance herself from social media for a while, seeking to rebuild her life from scratch, moving away from the superficiality that had consumed her for so long. My parents, deeply affected by everything that happened, finally began to treat me with the respect and recognition I always deserved, aware of how close they had been to completely losing our family relationship. I, for my part, finally felt a deep inner peace, understanding that my silent revenge had not only worked perfectly, but had triggered something much more important and lasting, a real and profound change in my family, finally forcing us to face the reality of our mistakes, learn from them, and grow together as we had never been able to do before.